Are you tired of phony social interactions and magic doodads? Do you just want to hack, slash, and stab your way to victory? Well, then this is the episode for you, because today we're talking all about fighters. Okay, Jake, what is a fighter?
Well, put simply, a fighter is anyone who fights. A fighter can be a lot of things. A fighter could be a mercenary or an enforcer. Maybe they trained under a knight.
So what you're saying is that they're combat specialists?
Absolutely, combat specialists and tacticians.
Someone who, for whatever reason, has picked up a weapon and decided to master that weapon. Be it the classic, your family was murdered by goblins and now you've taken the family heirloom sword and gone outside and trained for weeks on end to avenge their deaths. Maybe you're a pirate or a brigand, abandoned by society. Perhaps you're a nobleman, born to lead, trained in the martial arts from the time of your childhood, now ready to lead the regiment of your province. Whatever it may be, when you're a fighter, you know how to use all the weapons.
Not only all the weapons, but all the armors. There is no armor that a fighter is not proficient with, so long as it's not exotic armor.
Alright, so let's talk about races. What races make good fighters?
A lot of races are going to make good fighters, but in my opinion, if we're talking about the number one race, I think it's human. Fighters are already just drowning in feats, which they get the most feats of anybody in the game by far. And humans will also get a bonus feat at level 1, so that would mean at level 1 you would get your feat for just being level 1, you would get your feat for being a human, and you would get a feat for being a fighter. So at level 1 you would start with 3 feats. So humans have the option to put 2 points into any attribute. So you can pick and choose which you think is best for your character. Ton of versatility with the human fighter.
Humans are very versatile. They also have the skilled trait, which gives you that extra skill point every level. So you can kind of shore up the areas that you're not really that great at. Let's talk about dwarves. Dwarves are a class that makes a pretty good fighter. They get +2 to their constitution as well as wisdom, and their negative is in a charisma, which is kind of a dump stat for fighters. You don't really need it. Not to say that you can't have it, but it's not an optimized build. Moving on, we have elves, which get the +2 to dexterity as well as charisma, and -2 to constitution. Elves make a pretty good archer build fighter. They also have +2 to their saving throws versus enchantments, so as you get to higher levels, you're better able to resist magic users attempting to cast spells on you like Hold Person or Charm Person, among others. So an elf, although not fully optimized, can make a pretty good fighter. And then you have half-orcs and half-elves. Half-orcs are really, really good when geared towards fighter because they have orc ferocity, so they can continue to fight after they drop below 0 hit points for a round. And sometimes that 1 die roll is all you need. Half-elves are very similar to humans, and then they get that 1 skill-focused feat at level 1. So if you want to take Intimidate, you can bump that up a little bit if you want to get those distractions in combat or those feint maneuvers. Finally, rounding out the list, we have halflings and gnomes. What are your feelings on them?
Just trying to build a powerful character, that standpoint, yeah, they might not be ideal, but in terms of like a storytelling standpoint or just to have an entertaining time, absolutely totally viable races to use with fighter. They're just less used than the other races.
Right. They each get a -2 to strength, the gnome and the halfling, so they're not optimized for a melee combat fighter build, but you don't necessarily have to be optimized in order to have a good time. Yeah. Sometimes it's cool to be a 3-foot halfling, whip out a battle axe, and chop some orc legs off.
Yes.
It's just fun. And you have the feats where you can more than make up for that stat decrease that you take in strength. As for the favorite class options, none of them really stood out to us. They were some minor differences in combat maneuver defense, nothing to write home about, so we would usually just add the extra hit point per level in order to get you tougher so you can stay in those combats longer. Let's talk about fighters' proficiencies for a moment. Fighters are proficient in light, medium, and heavy armor. Oftentimes, people will just buy 1 set of armor at the beginning of the game, and they'll wear that armor until they find a better set, a heavier set, but Versatility is really the fighter's strong point. You are the Swiss Army knife of combat characters. So try and carry all 3 sets with you, a light, a medium, and a heavy. And if you need a wagon towed by a mule behind you in order to carry all of your equipment, so be it. Just remember that you are adaptable to the situation before you.
I remember I was running a campaign. So we had this player and he's got 3 weapons with him and we're like, okay, well this is kind of silly. And then at the time, we're using a deck of critical fumble cards, and he critically fumbled once and then critically fumbled twice later on during the session and lost his primary and secondary weapon and was forced to use the third in line. There's always going to be that situation where, well, you guys laughed at me for having a second and third weapon, now look who's still in the combat because of it.
Weapons are really what's going to drive you home, so bring all those different loadouts. Bring a two-handed weapon, bring a pole arm, bring a sword and a shield. Bring that mace in case you encounter undead creatures where that slashing damage just isn't going to do it for you. Bring those ranged weapons so if you encounter enemies that are far away or flying enemies that you can still interact in the fight. As a fighter, if you can get into that one-on-one me versus you mentality where you're focusing on one enemy, most of the time you're going to take them down in a combat scenario because that's really what your class is geared for.
Yeah, they're pretty much the masters of one-on-one, no magic, bare bones, me versus you with my equipment. Fighters are going to win almost all the time.
Also, take into account that you are proficient with all simple and martial weapons. And when you combine this with the armor proficiencies that you have, you essentially have the entire equipment list open to you. So take advantage of that. Bring along all the weapons that you're going to need for the different scenarios because that versatility is really, really what sets you apart from other combat classes like two-handed ranger, for example, or a rage barbarian.
Another thing about a fighter is they can fill that gap in, okay, well, we're kind of going through the adventure and, well, we found a couple weapons that nobody in the party is particularly proficient with, so we're just going to end up cashing them in and then using them on something else, like whatever, potions, new equipment, whatever it may be. A fighter is always going to be able to pick whatever it is up and use it, always. So you won't ever have that gap in equipment either.
Right. We've all played Diablo 2 or Diablo 3 where you get that random loot drop and it's a weapon that you can't use. It's kind of disappointing. But when you're a fighter in Dungeons & Dragons or the Pathfinder role-playing game and you find that weapon, you're able to use it. So you're going to get the hit points that you need in order to get in there and take some damage and give some damage back and stay in the fight. You also have a number of class skills. These include Climb, Craft, Handle Animal, Intimidate, Dungeoneering, Engineering, Profession, Ride, Survival, and Swim. Now, you're only going to be getting 2 skill ranks per level, plus your intelligence modifier. You kind of are going to be a little lacking in the skill tree. Try to coordinate with your other party members in order to, make sure that you shore up maybe something that your party is missing. But in reality, skills are not your expectation. That doesn't mean that you can't use your skills, because in the end, you're still a character with 2 hands and a mouth, and you can participate in these scenarios. And just because you can't necessarily do them well, doesn't mean you shouldn't try doing them. We've all played characters that have had a weakness, and what we've found is that when your character has a weakness, it makes it a more fun character to play, because there is an area where you're lacking. I mean, I played a dwarf fighter that had a terrible dexterity. Anytime he had to climb or jump over anything, he would fall in the pit constantly. But he had that really high constitution score, so he kind of made up for it. But
those stealth checks were hilarious.
You couldn't go anywhere sneakily with this dwarf.
It was like a walking chandelier.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I fell in a hole. I can't remember a session where I didn't fall in a hole, frankly. What was
Even
his name?
when there were no holes around to fall into, you managed.
Moving on, the most important class feature of the fighter is the bonus feats.
Absolutely.
Now you're going to get access to all the combat-oriented feats, which are marked with an asterisk in the core rulebook. Pathfinder's feat tree is very extensive, so it's kind of a study in order to figure out what the best feat combinations are. But some of the more popular feats include Quick Draw, which makes it so that you can get out the weapon that you need to, depending on the situation, as a free action.
I think if you are a melee fighter, that Quick Draw is the #1 feat to take. I absolutely believe that.
I mean, even if you're not a melee fighter, I still think Quick Draw is one of the best feats that you can have as a fighter. If you're doing the more melee build, you want to look into like the power attack, cleave, combat expertise, feats. That way you can deal more damage. You can fell multiple enemies. You can control combat with attacks of opportunity. With the combat expertise. And if you're building a more ranged-focused fighter, look at feats like point-blank shot, precise shot, deadly shot. Go through the book and look at all those little asterisk feats and see what's available to you as a fighter. And build your character around those feats. Another thing that I didn't know is that you can actually retool your feats as you level up. So if you're not happy with your current loadout, you can always reorganize it as you get to a new level.
Say initially you take precise shot. And then, because you're not really familiar with the party, you guys haven't really worked together all that much, but it turns out that it's very rare that you use that. All your guys are kind of ranged party members, they're trying to stay away from the enemy. You don't always get to use precise shot. Maybe you want to swap that out for something different. And it's free. It's not like you don't get your feat for that level, you still get your feat for that level. You just also get to swap one out and take a new one. So it's very useful for adapting. If you're constantly fighting the same type of enemy and you're constantly in a certain range or using a certain tactic, it might be nice to switch that out.
Absolutely. Again, that versatility is really what makes you the martial champion class. You cannot be touched in martial combat. We also have the armor mastery and weapon mastery abilities, which are your 19th and 20th level achievements. When you get armor mastery, you now take on damage reduction 5 whenever you're wearing your armor. Weapon mastery, you automatically confirm critical hits. So if you've used some of those combat feats on critical mastery or improved vital strike, you're going to see a huge jump in your damage when you get to this 20th level. Another of your class abilities is called weapons training. At 5, 9, 13, and 17th level, you can select a group of weapons to which you master. And you get a +1 and then initial one, and +1 in every one that you take thereafter. However, they stack. So if you choose swords and then you choose axes, you're going to get +2 in swords when you get that +1 in axes. So it's almost like having a magic weapon just as a class feature. It's really, really nice.
Yeah, so by the end of it, what you're looking at is you're going to have 4 different groups of weapons. Say we just take swords, axes, polearms, hammers. Okay? And you're going to have in your initial weapon that you took at 5, you're going to have +4, +4, and then at the one you took at 9, +3, +3, and then +2, +2, +1, +1. So in 4 groups, you will be more proficient with those weapons. The cumulative growth is fantastic.
And then you also get armor training at 3rd, 7th, 11th, and 15th level, which reduces your armor check penalty by 1 at each tier, and also increases the maximum dexterity bonus at each level. So you're not going to be slowed down by that heavy plate mail as much as you would normally be when taking a fighter class. You also have the Bravery class feature, which improves your resistance to fear effects, so you can stay in that fight when you take on the big bad, like terrifying dragons.
Yeah, well, fighters kind of have that small weakness in the will save, but when it's something that's just scary, they're really, really resistant to that. They'll get that bonus at level 2, and then they'll get an additional +1 to a will save versus fear every 4 levels thereafter, so 6, 8, 14. Oh. 6, 8,
Jacob
14.
can add.
I just went 4, 2, 6. Oh my god. Okay. And
yeah,
they'll get that
2, 6, 10, 14, and 18. I'm the smart one.
I don't know how that happened.
When you're a fighter and initiative has been rolled, depending on what loadout you are, whether or not you've gone archery or melee heavy build, that's going to determine what you're going to do in combat. So if you're an archer, kind of move to an area where you can take some cover and start pumping arrows or crossbow bolts into the scenario. If you're a melee fighter, position yourself between their big bad and your wizard in order to offer protection, or try and tie him up in a combat.
And as we kind of introduced the fighter, I mentioned the word tactician. And what I mean by that is that's kind of what comes into play before the combat. If you've been training your whole life to use all these different weapons, all these different armors, fighters are kind of the tacticians of the game a lot of the time. So before the battle starts, the fighter is usually the person that you look to decide, okay, well, how are we going to approach this? Are we going to go in through, the side gate? Are we just going to bull rush them through the front? What's the smartest thing to do? Usually you would consult your neighborhood fighter.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about what kind of fighters we would role play. One of the fighters that I like to play is an ex-soldier. I really like to play the ex-soldier build. I kind of think of a Roman legionary in my head and line up skills like engineering with this vision that I have. And as we go from place to place and we make camp, I fortify a little camp every night. Because I have that engineering background and that soldier's mentality where you get up every day at the same time. You train the same amount every day with the same weapons all day. You hone your skills in order to better improve. You change tactics based on what enemies you're fighting. You change weapons based on what enemies you're fighting. You always are looking to further develop your skill set in order to maximize your efficiency against a certain type of enemy. And I really feel that the ex-soldier is a character background that fits the fighter very well.
I also think that if we're talking about fighters from kind of an out of combat perspective, just drop all the stats and all what they can do out of combat, in terms of like a fighter's personality, is you think that they're so proficient with all these weapons and all these armors, that takes time. That means they've been training day to day, week to week, month to month, their whole life they've been doing this. They've been improving their abilities with this equipment. So that must mean that they're very determined characters. Mm-hmm. So in terms of a roleplay perspective, if you're wondering, okay, well, what's kind of one trait that my new fighter should have? I don't want him to just be a bland, boring guy who just swings a sword and uses a shield. I want him to kind of have a personality. One trait you might want to go with is determination. He's not going to be the guy that flakes out. So yeah, I just think that when you're playing a fighter, just remember that you're a really motivated and determined individual, and you've got a really strong mind.
What are some fighter concepts that you might be interested in playing or have played in the past?
I like the mercenary fighter. The fighter who's kind of in it for the gold and also just likes to exercise his talents. So that's kind of what I go with. I like the mercenary. That's why you're doing everything, is really just for the prize at the end of it. But over time, I like to kind of role play that whoever my party is, I start kind of growing accustomed to, and I really start to start caring about them. And after a while, it's not really about the reward, it's about keeping them from dying.
Oh, okay. So as you go on, you get more and more endeared to the party members around you.
So you start as kind of, when I play, like a lot of the times I like to, if I'm doing a fighter, is that you're just kind of like this emotionless mercenary, and by the end of it, you've grown into the party, you're integrated with them, you need them, they need you, and that's how you become a team.
So thank you for joining us for this episode of Total Cover. Again, I'm Zach, and this is my brother Jake, and we'd like to thank you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And now it's time for the roleplay outro. Bye, everybody.
I draw my sword and move towards Nash. I swing at him with my long sword.
All right, roll to hit.
19.
That hits. Roll damage.
9 damage.
All right, Nash growls, clutching the wound. It's his turn now.
A human with a few dull knives dares challenge Nash. Die!
The axe whirls around towards you. The great axe bounces off your breastplate. Eddie, it's your turn.
I move back by Magnus and start inspiring courage, giving everyone a bonus to hit and damage.
All right, Magnus, you blew the cover. What do you want to do? I cast mage armor on myself, raising my armor class. Okay, that brings us to the orc archers. Both of them will fire at the loudmouth bard. 1 miss and 1 hit for 5 damage.
Ah, great. There's blood on my cape.
Friedrich, you're up again.
I swing again, this time with power attack. Critical hit for 16 damage.
Your longsword digs deep into his throat and he falls backward onto the ground, dead. The orcs panic and flee into the forest.
Heh! Cowards!
Well fought, Friedrich.
Let's get out of these woods. It's getting dark and it's still a long way to Amaron. Edward, try to keep your mouth shut if you wouldn't mind. You got it, Friedrich. Lead the way.